This is Art Space, a look at where art and outer space come together. I'm Roger Launius. I'm with the Space History Division of the National Air and Space Museum, a part of the Smithsonian Institution. This segment looks at a Russian satellite that changed America. Or maybe it didn't.
As a result of intensive work by research institutes and designing bureaus, the first artificial Earth satellite in the world has now been created.
What you're hearing is the sound of Sputnik, launched in October of 1957. In October of 1957, the United States and the Soviet Union was locked in a Cold War struggle. Two competing economic and political systems that were locked in an intense rivalry that could ultimately mean the destruction of both civilizations. The belief was that if the Soviets could launch a satellite, Sputnik, over our heads, they also had the capability to bring a nuclear weapon down on our heads. All of this is part of a much larger master narrative, and a master narrative is essentially a discussion of how things have been remembered over time and what we think of as the basic ingredients of the story. We tend to accept the story as it's told to us today without too much controversy. We do know the Soviet Union launched Sputnik on the 4th of October. We believe that this immediately changed the world, and all of the people in the United States ran around with their hair on fire. They were afraid of what might result from this, and there were great concerns that prompted Americans to respond with a whole series of actions that ultimately led to the triumph in the space race in the 1960s with the Apollo moon landings in 1969. Interestingly enough, the real story of Sputnik is a bit more complex than this master narrative would allow you.
You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
What you're hearing is a newsreel report about Sputnik 1. Newsreels were very common before most people had television, and they would go to the movie theaters to hear about the latest news and see the images thereof. Did you catch that last part? One of the great scientific feats of the age. That's the way a lot of people saw Sputnik. Not necessarily that they were so terribly afraid of it. There were other people who were concerned about what would take place. They were concerned about the capability that the launcher had for delivering nuclear weapons, and they compared what had happened with Sputnik, that sudden launch of this Soviet satellite, to a technological Pearl Harbor, the way the Japanese had attacked the Americans to start World War II.
In some respects, I think it is an even greater challenge. In my opinion, we do not have as much time as we had after Pearl Harbor.
Now, in 1957, Sputnik was not quite the surprise that the earlier Pearl Harbor attack had been. There had been a lot of emphasis on the launching of a scientific satellite as part of the International Geophysical Year, or the IGY.
As the International Geophysical Year opens, the satellite is ready.
The International Geophysical Year was an international effort to cooperate on learning more about climate, about the weather patterns, and about the geophysical nature of the Earth. Robert Smith is a space historian at the University of Alberta in Canada. He explains what the IGY was supposed to accomplish.
They were interested in things like aurora, magnetic fields in the polar regions, meteorology, and any geophysical phenomena that they could measure.
And Robert Smith says that from the very beginning, it was decided that one of the goals of IGY would be to put human-made satellites into orbit.
With a rocket, you could get maybe 5 minutes of observations from above the atmosphere. With a satellite, you have a potentially unlimited time of observations from above the atmosphere.
The IGY got a lot of attention from the media. The Soviet Union had announced that they were going to launch a satellite, and so did the United States. So I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that it was such a big surprise when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik.
Sputnik, space helmets, and Santa. There's a jolly Christmas ahead for us all.
If you want more evidence that America was not completely shocked by Sputnik, take a look at how Sputnik was treated in American music and culture. Remember how everyone was scared after the 9/11 attacks? We are told that everyone was just as scared after Sputnik. But if that's really true, why did so many people write happy songs about the incident?
Well, let's say the fun has just begun. We're on Sputnik #1. Fly through outer space in a rocket
What you're hearing is Jerry Engler and the Four Echoes singing Sputnik Satellite Girl. According to Margaret Weidekamp, who works with me at the National Air and Space Museum,
you see a lot of songs, popular music, R&B, swing, rock and roll, that adopt the beep, beep, beep into some of their lyrics.
Well, ever since those satellites first, we've been circling around the earth.
there are all manner of genres of Sputnik songs. There's country songs, there's blues songs. Louis Prima had a Sputnik song in his lounge act in Las Vegas.
She doesn't write me and I can't sleep. All I hear from her is my baby's fooling around with a satellite. Now you know that ain't right.
Sputnik was not a very impressive object in many ways. It was a round sphere, 22 inches in diameter, with 4 trailing antennae off of it. It was made of aluminum, so it was kind of shiny and looked a little futuristic. Margaret Weidekamp says that there were lots of things you saw all around that looked like Sputnik.
Things like Eames chandeliers, which have these long, thin tubes that have the light bulbs at the ends of them. And you find Christmas ornaments that are essentially a starburst, but then with the kind of silver, sparkly glitter that you have on them now seem to have been very much evoked by Sputnik. They remind us of those spiked, antennaed, round, silvery spheres, which are satellites.
And there were plenty of other things shaped like Sputnik.
Ashtrays to toasters to even cars that were inspired, if not directly by the Sputnik, at least indirectly by the zeitgeist that it brought with it.
Paola Antonelli is a design curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City.
Home appliances, especially TV sets and radios, even I would say hairdressers' dryer helmets, they changed their shape after the Sputnik was introduced.
After the launch of Sputnik, a lot of car companies adopted spacey names for their cars. There was the Mercury Comet and the Plymouth Satellite, among many others. All of these were viewed as futuristic, and that meant that they would be something that was forward-looking and progressive. We had previously based a lot of our concepts for the future on airplanes. Now we began to transfer that to spacecraft and space activities.
All of a sudden, it was like moving from the atmosphere to the stratosphere to open space.
Lots of commercial products ended up with Sputnik names in 1957. There was the Sputnik Burger. It was a hamburger with Russian dressing and a cocktail weenie on the top. A professional wrestler by the name of Rocco Monroe, who was based in Memphis, Tennessee, changed his name and wrestled for the rest of his career as Sputnik Monroe. And Margaret Weidekamp says Sputnik entered the language with people adding "nick" to the ends of words.
Even things like beatnik, which we don't often think of as having an influence from Sputnik, was in fact coined by someone who was interested in disparaging the beat generation and referred to them, russifying the name, and called them beatniks, and it has stuck.
There were, of course, legitimate concerns about Sputnik and what it portended for the future. There was a genuine, legitimate fear in America. A lot of people were concerned that World War III might be just around the corner, as these two superpowers would ultimately end up declaring nuclear war on each other. And yet, there was a Russian satellite being celebrated. Paola Antonelli says this has to do with the fact that we heard 2 messages in Sputnik's beep.
The Sputnik, you know what? It was the Soviet Union, it was fearsome, but it was all about advances, it was about progress, and therefore it was safe to celebrate.
Fear of the Sputnik and what it portended would certainly come later. Lyndon Johnson convinced many Americans that Sputnik meant the Russians were going to drop bombs on our heads. But for most Americans, they probably didn't think about this, at least initially. People in many respects were very excited by the launch of this new satellite in Earth's orbit, and it was a dawn of a new age. It was the dawn of the space age. Even though the Soviets had done it first, the United States was well on its way to doing it themselves, and we were excited about those prospects.
Well, you talk about your Sputnik and your hound dog crew. I got a rocket baby faster than the Asiatic flu.
Thanks for listening. I'm Roger Launius of the National Air and Space Museum for Arts Edge, a program of the Education Department of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts.
Well, she got no speed and Sputnik now.